Okay, we'll get started, and welcome to everybody. Hello, and welcome to Generative HSC's second webinar. My name is Jason Thain, and I'm the Senior Consultant here at Generative HSC. Today's webinar is focusing on critical risk, and if you stream this webinar live and have any questions, please type them into the question area. And if you're listening to this webinar at a later date and you've got any questions, feel free to contact myself via phone or email, or get in contact with any of the Generative HSC team members. Critical risk is a subject very close to my heart. Whilst working in the mining industry around 6 years ago, I witnessed a workplace fatality, and if you've ever been involved in such an event, you'll fully understand the impact it has on the workplace. These impacts are many and are felt right through the community and the organisation where the fatality occurs. And having seen the consequences of a workplace fatality, I've made it my personal mission to prevent this happening again. This webinar flows on quite well from Mark's previous webinar on safety leadership, and you'll find that many of the ideas Mark shared back in November certainly tie in nicely with critical risk. Some of you may be aware of what critical risk is, and it may be known under a different title within your organisation. What I'm talking about today when I'm talking about critical risk is any task that has potential to cause a single or multiple fatality within a workplace. The principles that I discuss can be applied across any industry or workplace, and of course the risk and controls will vary, but the fundamentals will still apply. Okay, so what is critical risk? As I mentioned previously, critical risk is any task that has the potential to cause a single or multiple fatality within a workplace. It can also relate to a financial impact on an organisation. However, this session will focus on critical risk from the fatality perspective and not the financial perspective. If you are interested in finding out more about applying critical risk from a financial perspective, you can contact me or any of the Generative team members after the webinar. Okay, so how's critical risk determined? It's easy to say that critical risk is any task that can cause a fatality, but you need to go a little deeper to gain exactly what that means. If you do a risk assessment on a task and review the task with identified controls in place, that task may rate low on the overall risk rating. However, in order to understand which task can result in fatality, you need to understand the consequences of the event occurring if the task was conducted with all controls absent or ineffective. Okay, this may seem odd, and the reason for applying this method is in many cases when a fatality has occurred in a workplace, controls have been absent or ineffective. An analogy I like to use is if you were to do a risk assessment on an employee driving from one job site to another. When you're doing this assessment, you may include controls such as trained and competent operator, using a maintained and serviceable vehicle, and adhering to fatigue management procedures or policies. And in most organisations, this task would probably rate somewhere in the acceptable range with all of those controls being assessed. However, how would the same task rate if the operator was not trained or competent? If the vehicle they were driving was not well maintained, for example, the brakes didn't work, the taillights didn't work, the tyres were bald, I think that would rate somewhere in the don't even think about it range if you didn't have your controls in place. Having said that, the second scenario is very unlikely to occur. However, it does show that if the task was conducted by just anyone using a poorly maintained vehicle, things could go bad very quickly. Applying the principle to a task won't always rate a task as critical, and I also want you to bear in mind that if you do apply this in your organisation, it's not always going to mean a whole heap of new procedures or controls need to be designed and implemented. And what I've found that in many cases, it simply means applying a bit more rigour to what it is that we already do. You can also use industry taxonomy as a great way to understand what tasks may be critical within your organisation or industry. And taxonomy doesn't need to only relate to your geographical location, for example, the state or country you're operating in. In fact, if we look at incidents in less safety evolved cultures in our own, it gives us a really good insight into absent or ineffective controls. Before we move on, it'd be really good to pause and consider what the critical risks in the workplaces that the streamers have, and also to think about critical controls that they may have. So what I'm going to do now is just open up a poll, and if everyone could just have a look at that and click on the response that they deem most appropriate to their workplace. Okay, so first off, we have my organisation has a firm grasp on what critical risks are in our day-to-day operations. The options you've got there are strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. We're just waiting for results to come in there. Okay, and I'll just see if I can bring those up on your screen now. Okay, I'm having a few issues bringing that up. I can relay the results, however. What we've got in response to that question is we have 13% strongly agree, 50% agree, 25% disagree, and 13% strongly disagree. Okay, so that is quite an interesting response, and it's really great to see that we've got a large proportion of the people streaming today that do feel that do strongly agree or agree that their organisation does have a firm grasp on critical risks. And I guess for those that have indicated responses lower than agree, it may be some consideration that need to be applied on critical risks within your workplace. Okay, I'll flick to the second question now. Okay, second we have, my organisation, we have clearly defined critical controls to manage our critical risks. And that should be open now, and again the options are the same. Okay, what I'll do, I'll have another go at bringing up the results here and see if I can share those with you. Okay, and hopefully you can see them on your screen now. Again, we've got about 50% within the agree and strongly agree range, so that's encouraging. And again, just for those that are below the agree range, just as we go through this webinar, see what it is that's discussed and how that can be applied in your work area. And again, if there are questions, please feel free to type them into the questions area on your screen. Okay, and now we'll go to the third question. Okay, and the third question that we have is, I'm confident most of the time that critical controls are implemented and fully effective. Okay, and it seems that everyone's voted there, and I'll share those results as well. Okay, so you can see 6% strongly agreed with that, 35% agreed, we had 35% disagree, and 24% strongly disagree. So I guess looking into that, we've got about half of the people here today that believe their organisation's got a good grasp on critical risk and that there's clearly defined controls. However, out of that 50%, there's a small portion that believe that the critical controls are implemented fully and are fully effective. Okay, and I'd like to thank everyone for voting on that, and there were some pretty interesting results there. Okay, so if we know a task is critical, what's next? If a task is rated as critical, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. It just means that there are additional safeguards that we need to put in place to protect personnel that are exposed to risks associated with the task. The approach I like to take with critical risk is layered, and it gives everyone from the shop floor to the boardroom a part to play. Okay, and one of the safeguards I'm referring to are critical controls, and I see that Scott has a question there around what is a critical control, and we'll get to that now. Okay, critical controls are those select few controls that must be in place prior to a critical risk task commencing. They don't negate the need for other controls that are associated with the task, however, they're non-negotiable. Okay, so if they're not present, the task doesn't commence full stop, and that should be fully understood by the entire workforce. Selecting the right critical control for a task is essential, and it's really essential that that's done in conjunction with the personnel that are responsible for conducting the task. For example, the workforce. When assigning critical control cells, saying less is more definitely applies. If there are too many critical controls, it can erode the importance of them, and the worker can quickly be overwhelmed if there are too many, and that can result in lip service being paid to something that's been deemed critical. So considerations when selecting critical controls. Got three of them here. It's certainly not the be-all end-all list, but it's certainly three things that I like to apply as a test when reviewing critical controls. The first one, if it was a last standing control, would it ultimately prevent serious injury or fatality? So if all the controls associated with that task, if that was the only one that was sort of in place and effective, would it prevent that? Second of all, is it possible to follow the control whilst undertaking high risk work? So it's got to be something that can be applied during any part of the task that the work is undertaking, not something that you can apply during the start of a task, but throughout the whole task, and certainly whilst undertaking high risk work, as that's obviously a volatile time. And thirdly, can the control be monitored and evaluated by people in the field? That one's very important as well, because if the worker can't guarantee that particular control is in place, I guess it's very hard for them if they're just relying on the fact that someone behind the scenes is doing something and they can't verify that. Okay, and remember, critical controls should be stated in layman's terms. I remember having a rather robust conversation with someone much senior to my position at the time about terminology that I'd used in a critical control, and basically he said words to the effect of, well, the CEO wouldn't understand that, and what he was getting at, that there wasn't enough corporate terminology used. And to which I replied to him, with all due respect, he wouldn't be the one that's going to be hit by it. And funnily enough, he did see my point of view in the end there. So again, it's very important that it's pitched at the level of the workforce and try to avoid making it overly complex, complicated. Critical controls are the foundation of the whole critical risk process, and they must be tailored to suit the personnel using them. Like I said earlier, applying critical risk or critical controls doesn't always mean you need to implement new controls or procedures. Think about a working at height task in your organisation. Your current procedures might state the requirement that any personnel working above a certain height must be wearing correct fitting serviceable harness. That can be made a critical control. It's not new, but now it's clearly understood that prior to doing that task it must be worn. It's non-negotiable. And if the right tools are used, anyone on your job site will be aware of this. So why should you do that? Well, your procedures for working at height probably include many other requirements for a task, and these procedures may not always be on the job. So making the harness critical control makes it clearly defined and easy to remember for the user. Okay, so how does the workforce know that tasks are critical and the controls that are required to manage them? Critical controls should be used in conjunction with a pre-start or pre-task assessment tool. For example, when the worker is walking the job, they should have a checklist that prompts them to assess if the task you're about to conduct is critical, and if so, what critical controls need to be in place. Some industries use a thing called a Take 5 or other tools that the worker will fill in. They can be adapted to include things to prompt workers to ensure that, or to assess whether the task they're about to conduct is critical, and if it is, what controls are required. And these pre-task assessment tools may vary from organisation to organisation, and there's also some great new technology-based tools that can be used using smart devices like tablets, phones, iPads, iPhones, etc. And using technology has many benefits to the organisation. It can give real-time critical risk profiles, and it also presents a really good opportunity for worker-supervisor interaction. That doesn't mean that they have to be there face-to-face, but they can interact via these devices. Having said that, there's also some great paper-based methods for workplaces that may be restricted by the cost or the need for intrinsically safe items, or having little to no access to Wi-Fi or cellular data, etc. And these tools are just as important as a critical control themselves, because if we don't have these tools and people aren't assessing whether the task is critical, they're not going to be aware that it's a critical risk, and there's potential for critical controls to be absent, and that may result in a fatality. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just play a quick video. Okay, that's a bit of the old road runner for people that are old enough to remember that one. I am. Now, if old Wile E. Coyote there had applied critical risk and critical control methodology to that particular task, he would have prevented himself a serious headache. And using these tools, it helps people to understand that, clearing those hung rocks would have been a critical risk, and the controls would have put him out of the firing line and ensured his PPE was somewhat more effective than the little pink umbrella that he used. And your workforce at times can rush into tasks or conduct tasks outside of their normal scope of work. And applying critical risk and critical control methodology will protect them from fatalities. My experience in interacting with frontline personnel has shown me that critical risk is as important to the workers as it is to the management of their organisations. You know, it's very simple. It's there to protect their lives and the lives of their mates. It's a very easy sell because, you know, it's all about, you know, preservation of their life, their mates' lives. So people really do understand the importance of it. From my experience, the workforce hasn't just seen it as some new thing that management's trying to bring in. They do see the merit in it. Okay, so let's say you've applied the critical risk methodology, you've assigned critical controls for all your critical risks, and you've got an effective pre-start assessment tool. I guess what you need to know now is how can you ensure that that control is relevant and effective months or years after it's implemented. That brings me to my next point, which is critical control standards. Critical control standards are a tool that's used to stipulate the framework for a critical control, and it sets the parameters on how the control works, how it's designed and how it's audited. I spoke earlier about having a layered approach, and this is what I was referring to. As we just looked at, frontline personnel are accountable to assess whether a task is critical and what critical controls are required and in place prior to commencing their task, and their supervisors are accountable to ensure that that is in fact happening. The next layer is critical control standards, and that's usually, the responsibility for those usually fall on the superintendent or equivalent for the design, implementation and auditing of these critical control standards. And managers are responsible to ensure it's happening. So critical control standards are documents that they exist for each critical control, so every critical control has to have one. And they give the detail as to what the control is, how it works, how it's inspected or audited, and the frequency of auditing, who it's reported to, and how the faults in the control are recorded and reported, and who's responsible for each of the components. It's very important because if you've got critical controls in place, you need to know what actions have to be taken if there is an issue with that control. The control standards are very important because if they're established and followed properly, they will detect a weakness or fault within the critical control. For example, over time tasks may change, due to new equipment or other factors, and these changes may erode the effectiveness of a particular control. The critical control standards detect the change in control effectiveness and guide the user on how to remedy the issue. So we'll break this down a little further. The intended purpose of a control, how it should work, what the control is. So let's use our earlier example of a harness for working at height tasks. So there's no point just saying that you need to wear a harness. There's many different types of harnesses on the market, and many may not be suitable for use in your workplace. So the standard control should clearly define how it's worn and what the tolerabilities are. For example, free of any defects that would impair the harness working for its intended use, or a stipulated inspection frequency. It's not just written as a harness, it clearly defines what is meant by harness. The next thing, the control standard should stipulate an inspection and audit frequency. That's not necessarily relating particularly just to the harness, but that's relating to the control. So how often somebody should be out in the field checking that this control is being used by the workforce. And the weaker the control is, i.e. where it would sit on the hierarchy of controls, will play a large part in determining the frequency of inspections and audits. And once these inspections and audits have been determined, you can then use existing work management tools or spreadsheets for smaller organisations to manage those audits as they're required. And of course the inspections and audits should be verified by management or governance or corporate as relevant to the organisation. And these verifications provide the next layer of critical risk. Now that you've established an inspection or audit time frame, The document must clearly describe how the control is inspected or audited. It's vital as the inspection must be carried out the same way, measuring the same thing every time. And if that doesn't occur, this can achieve an inaccurate control effectiveness measuring. So it's vital that every person that goes and carries out that audit or inspection is doing it the same way as everyone else is. Okay, I've just got a bit of an update on the siege in Sydney, for those who don't have access. Apparently the Opera House has been evacuated over a suspicious package. It's unknown if it's linked to the Lint hostage situation. So that's something that's just come in. Rightio, we'll continue on with the webinar. The development of critical control standards can be time consuming initially. However, once a suitable template that's effective for your organisation is developed, it becomes a lot easier. Okay, now I'd like to take a moment to discuss obstacles that you may encounter when implementing critical risk in an organisation. Okay, control standards can be a point, or the development of control standards can be a point within critical risk where compliance can easily overtake intent. I'm very fixated when implementing critical risk that the intent is to prevent fatality and it's not to comply with the new system that's been introduced. So therefore it must be built from the ground up. So, start with the control and then how you're going to govern the control. You don't come up with a way of governing the system and then design the system around that. It's important that the intent is focused on the control itself, how that's going to function, and then worry about how you're going to measure it. It's tempting to change things to suit reporting requirements, especially in larger organisations. However, it can detract from the intent. Other obstacles encountered with that can be encountered with the implementation of critical risk is failure to engage the end user during the design phases. This includes frontline operators for the initial identification of what your critical risks and tasks may be, and also whilst developing the critical controls themselves. If the end users aren't involved, it can lead to unworkable solutions that just then leads to frustration, and it tends to undermine the process. And that goes right through the layers. I've seen critical control standards developed in isolation by an individual in an office, and that's led to inspections and audits not measuring what's actually required for that control. So it's really important to get that buy-in. That buy-in makes sure that it is a workable solution, and it also gives ownership. So if your workforce is involved in the design of this, they feel a part of it. And secondly, like implementing any new thing, there can be a bit of resistance. But as I said earlier, critical risk isn't a hard thing to sell to your frontline personnel or anyone in the organisation, providing that it's implemented in a well-structured way. I've seen organisations race to implement critical risk and similar things, and they fall short of the mark as a result of poor workforce engagement. So it's vital that you do engage your workforce the whole way on the journey. It doesn't have to be long and laborious, but it's important that engagement's done and you don't just race to get the thing implemented. Okay, to summarise, critical risk is relevant and achievable for any industry or organisation. As we've discussed today, you've got a lot of tools there. It can, can rely heavily on technology for verifications, etc. It can be as basic as paper-based tools and spreadsheets. It really does vary on the organisation. It also ensures that rare events, when they occur, aren't met with fatal consequences. Some events could be a 1 in 100 year event, but what if today was that day? Controls in place that would prevent a fatality in your organisation on the rare chance that something would happen. As I said, there's many tools that are available that cater to all sizes and budgets. So you don't need to be a large company to adopt these principles. It can be done on a shoestring budget. Okay, in the webinar invite you would have noticed a quote by Dr. Robert Long, and it reads that measuring safety performance by the number of injuries you have is like measuring parenting by the number of smacks you give. That's a really good quote, and I believe it speaks directly to Mark's November webinar on mindful safety leadership and also this webinar on critical risk. I'd also like to leave you with another quote, and this time it's from La Zhu. And the quote reads, "If you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading." So now I'd like to open up to the people streaming on the webinar for any questions they have. And there's a question here already from Scott, and Scott asks, how would you test effectiveness of a critical control? To answer that can depend on quite a few things, Scott, but basically with your control performance, critical control standards, they'll define that, and it can depend on what the control is. If it's something that you can actually physically go out in the field and verify, it would tell you what it is you were looking for. So, for example, with the harness, it may tell you to go down and ensure that personnel that are working at height tasks are wearing a harness. It may go in and stipulate that has the harness got a test tag on it, is the harness connected with the correct lanyard to a rated anchor point, etc. Or it could be a more engineering standard where you'd go and check the tolerance of a piece of plant equipment. So that does vary on what the critical control is to what the effectiveness test may be. And also the document should give you whether or not that it's adequate or inadequate. Does anyone else have any questions out there? Okay, Tony's come up with a really good question. How do you determine the right number of critical controls for an individual critical risk? There's no magic number for this, but as I spoke to earlier, you're better to keep them to a select few. I remember a conversation with Mark where he had stated that there was a particular critical control or a particular task that he observed that had upward of, I think, 15 critical controls. I guess that could be realistic depending on what your control is or what your risk is. However, but bear in mind, if you have too many, it can become complex and people then struggle to really be able to verify that they're all in place. So there's no magic number. In the past, I've usually kept it to around 4 or 5, but sometimes there's been less and sometimes there's been more. But certainly trying to keep the number of critical controls for an individual risk, yeah, less is definitely better. Thanks for that question, Tony. Is there any other questions out there? Okay, and again from Tony, do you know a good KPI to measure the effectiveness of critical controls? Well, basically, with your critical controls when you're out, your critical control standard should basically give you whether or not, will give you the criteria to state whether or not the critical control is effective, and you can create quite simple or quite complicated dashboards that will give you an overall score on all of your critical risks. It'll break it down to one particular risk, or it'll give you an overall snapshot of all your critical risks combined. So basically, your critical control standard will provide the effectiveness of your control when you go out and do the inspection or audit as stipulated by that document. Hopefully that answers your question, Tony. And yes, it did. Good. Has anyone else got any other questions? I'll just give it a couple more seconds there. Like I said, if you do have any questions following this webinar, feel free to contact myself or any of the Generative HSE team. I'm sure Josh has sent out details on how to contact us, and Joshua is a good point of contact if you're unsure of how to get a hold of me. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We had a good turnout, and basically, obviously, if the going's on in Sydney today, there's some people, it can be hard to stay focused on things. Basically, I'd like to thank everyone, and I thank you very much for your responses to the polls and also for the questions that have been asked. And from myself and the entire Generative HSE team, we hope that your families, colleagues and yourselves have a safe and happy Christmas, and hope that New Year brings wonderful opportunities for you. Thank you very much.